This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. And that without killing each other is really important. I am your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Remember, subscribe or follow, depending on what your app lets you do, and definitely leave us that rating and especially write that review. The reviews in particular really do help. I'll put a link in our show notes to make it easy for you to do just that. And by the way, we popped. This month we've been doing really good. I saw that we were up there. I think we were as high as number two on one of the charts for our area, our subject matter. So that was really encouraging to see. Cracking the top 100 in all podcasts worldwide. So that's super encouraging as well. We'll see if that lasts. They might get tired of me real quick. But anyway, all of this stuff really does help. As you can see, it's important so that more people can participate in conversations like these, like the one that we're having today with Robert Schwartz. Robert Schwartz is the co-founder and senior advisor for Haley Voters for Biden. And I'm so grateful. You're like right in the center and the thick of it, Robert. I'm so grateful for you joining me today. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wanted to talk a little bit about your background. I saw that you studied poli-sci at Emory, and I was curious, was that something that as a kid, as a teenager, like a subject that you were really keenly curious about, or was that something that kind of emerged over the course of your undergrad work?
Yeah, so I think in high school, I was interested in politics. We had like local Missouri politicians come and speak to our high school. And then I had thought I had started with political science and organic chemistry at Emory. And I just found that I really loved the politics classes and not so much all the time in labs and stuff like that for chemistry. So I decided to just go for political science and Spanish. I really can credit, there was one professor who had served as Jimmy Carter's national security advisor for Latin America. His name was Bob Pastor. He's passed away since then, but he just had such cool stories about like going to observe presidential elections and talking to this leader or that leader. And I was like, I want to be like him. So that's kind of what really got me into foreign policy.
And then you ultimately studied Spanish as well. Was that part of what prompted you in that specific direction?
Yeah, so I did some study abroad in the Caribbean, and then I went to Argentina right after the kind of 2001 financial crisis, where I think they had like 5 presidents in 2 weeks or something like that. So so it was kind of a fascinating experience and got me interested in, specifically foreign policy and mostly in Latin America.
So this is going to sound like a totally ignorant question. You went on to get your master's of public policy from Harvard. What is a program like that? Like, how does a kid find out about a program like that? And what does a program like that entail?
Yeah, so I mentioned this professor, and I started to hear about other people who were interested in policy. I'd applied for a couple scholarships and didn't get them. So I was like, oh, well, if I really want to advance in this field, you go to a place, and particularly like foreign policy, there's like the Georgetown Masters in Foreign Service. There's
So wait, are you about to say that Harvard was your safe school for this?
No, but I had interned for like a year at the Carter Center too, and they and been abroad for a year, so I was kind of ready to get back into school at that point, and it was a great program because you had a lot of people with a lot more career experience than I had, who had already been in the field, and the classes are great, the professors are great, but I think more importantly, just like the network that you build there, and the types of things that people have done since you get presidents and prime ministers of different countries that, that have been there, and the World Bank, and, all kinds of really smart people that are there. So it's cool just getting to interact with them.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, as someone who's, a founder, senior co-founder, senior advisor for Haley Voters for Biden, that's a very particular space in our current, the current landscape, if you will. I was curious about your own political philosophy. Did you start to arrive at certain positions throughout your undergrad and graduate work, or did you have certain leanings going in, or have they evolved over time?
Yeah, so I mean, I've been relatively I guess left of center for most of my life. I guess in college I worked for like a Democratic campaign. That it was actually the famous race where like Mel Carnahan passed away through a plane crash, and his wife took over for that Senate race. So I'd been a little bit involved in Missouri Democratic politics, but that family is a relatively kind of centrist family committed to public service. So fast forward like 10 years, I had worked a little bit more on the Hill with Russ Carnahan and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. So I had tended to vote Democrat, but not like, I never kind of saw myself as being like, very partisan. What really motivated this effort was more actually the foreign policy and working on like Latin America and international politics worldwide, because I viewed, you know, uh, this is not so much for me, the partisanship, the ideology doesn't matter as much as like preserving our institutions and not losing our the things we hold most dear, like our commitment to democracy and human rights and certain, ideals. And so what I saw happening at the end of President Trump's term was something that, looked a little familiar to me, having worked on some of these other countries, and it really scared me.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, as you say, a huge part of your vocational efforts, your professional life has been in foreign affairs, and in particular on authoritarian regimes in countries where, as you might describe it, where democracy is backsliding. I think that's the way you put it. So, given your perspective of seeing other nations around the world where democracy is definitely we can see it deteriorating before our eyes. Anne Applebaum, for example, has done a lot of work on countries in Eastern Europe. Are you concerned about the stability of American democracy?
Yes, and I would say the
You
two
didn't
countries.
equivocate there. I was hoping for, as Will Salatan calls them, like shiny ponies, but there's no, like, yes, I am concerned.
Yeah, it's not if for that it's not a yes or no. Uh, there's I am very concerned, and that was part of what motivated me to kind of basically take a leave from my prior experience to work on domestic issues. And the reason I think, I worked mostly for about 6 years, I think, on Venezuela and Nicaragua. And in both cases, you had uh, leaders who were elected democratically, who over time, it's not like, it happens with a boom, right? It's over time, they slowly erode democracy. They pick people who are loyal to them, and they put them in key positions. They elevate family members. And what we saw, the last country that I worked on in Nicaragua, you had an autocratic leader who lost an election around, I think, 1990. And then he lost two or three elections in between the time that he then came back. And then he he put the entire like legislature and judiciary and civil society business leaders, they all started becoming allies or part of his Sandinista party. And you know, when I was working on it, he arrested 9 presidential opposition leaders. His wife and his children are probably going to carry on his legacy. And I saw this, and it's like there are a lot of similarities to what happened in Nicaragua than to what is happening or potentially going to happen in the United States.
So I don't know if you're familiar with Project 2025 that Heritage Foundation is curating and putting out, but what I've read so far, there's a lot of material there, but what I've read so far, I'm wondering if the guys who are putting that together are actually studying countries like Venezuela and adapting some of those tactics, some of those strategies. How familiar are you with Project 2025, and am I on the right track here, or what do you think?
I mean, I'm familiar with it. I don't know to what extent the people leading the project are familiar with how dangerous their ideas have worked out in other countries. But certainly this idea of placing, loyalists in key positions of power, and not only that, basically totally wiping out the civil service, which kind of served as a guardrail to Trump's worst impulses during the first term. That's threatening. That's incredibly threatening to any democracy. But there are other aspects of Project 2025, and honestly, I think, just the way Trump handled losing the last election, and the way he's going to proceed on future elections is the piece that most scares me, even beyond Project 2025.
Man, yeah, it's reason to be concerned. I was listening to some conversations. One in particular, we had Elizabeth Newman on, and she had a conversation with Charlie Sykes. She was prescient. She and Charlie talked in mid-December, like December 15th of 2020. And she said, she's really concerned about January 6th. She identified January 6th, knowing that was the day that the formality of certifying, the electoral college votes would happen. And she was seeing what was happening with her experience at working at a high level in Trump's administration. And she called it a lot, and she wasn't the only one. A lot of other folks saw what was going to happen. She was in particular concerned about not just January 6th, but in the weeks between January 6th and, when Biden would be sworn in. And she was absolutely right. But before we move on, I wanted to tell you about something else that's important. Money. Specifically your money. In all seriousness, I wanted to tell you about my advisor and my friend, George Meza. George runs Meza Wealth Management. And with George, it's not just about money. It's about helping us manage our present and plan for our future. And unlike a lot of other firms out there, George and I actually have a relationship. He knows me, he knows my family, and I know his wonderful family. I also know his firm and the incredible team he's put together, from his chief investment officer to some of the other great people in his office, like Jessica, their head of operations, that are always there to help me and with all aspects of our portfolio. You see, the thing is, I got a lot going on. I guess we all got a lot going on, and I don't have the time to watch our investments all day, every day. And even if I did, I don't have the experience and expertise that George's team collectively has. So we get the entire Meza Wealth Management team, all their expertise and all their integrity. And again, it's based on George knowing me personally, knowing my goals, and even the kind of risk that's appropriate for me to take, which, by the way, could change from one season to the next. And they're on top of all of that. So if you want George Meza and Meza Wealth Management to be on your team, just visit their website, mezawealth.com. That's MEZA wealth.com, www.mezawealth.com. And that will also be in our show notes, so you can check that. And now, back to our show. I guess I'm looking for, encouragement and reasons to be optimistic that it's going to be okay. But I'm not getting a lot of those signs from you right now.
Well, in fact, I mean, I don't want to be an alarmist, but I think actually a lot of people I talk to do try to take a more optimistic spin, and I think the optimistic argument is, look, even though Venezuela was the longest standing democracy and wealthiest democracy in Latin America, Venezuela and Nicaragua did not have the same history of institutions, and that the United States has this long-standing history of separation of powers, of institutions where, the longest-running democratic experiment in the world. And so Trump may try to do some of these things, but he's not going to succeed. And I think that comforts a lot of people. And I'm actually going to do the opposite, which is to say that if you look at the kinds of tactics that Trump used, and in particular, his calling the Secretary of State of Georgia and pressuring, to find whatever it was, 12,000 votes, and pressuring, local election officials in Michigan, and pressuring, what was it, the Arizona kind of election officials and, leadership there. And then his own vice president, like setting aside the, all the riots and that stuff, like Mike Pence, I read a book. I guess what I'll say is we were hanging on by a thread because Mike Pence didn't decide until the day of January 6th to certify the election. He had the option of just telling, Congress that we needed to study it a little bit more, or taking a slightly different path. And then it would have gone to the legislature. If any of these Republican officials had chosen to be loyal to Trump instead of like their constitutional or state-led obligations, then they could have withheld electors from voting the way that their state had voted. And so if you think about that, and you think about the 2028 election, where Trump has 4 years to basically install, to support election officials that will be more loyal to him when those kinds of situations come up, not to mention, his vice president, it's just very unlikely to me that he would allow for a totally free and fair election when this has been such an obsession of his, and that he's totally unable to lose elections. I'm not alarmist in the sense that I think he would necessarily continue in power or, get rid of, what is it, the 22nd Amendment or something like that. But he will, but I think he will tilt the playing field so that it is not a free and fair election, and so that his side will not be able to lose. And that's the very fundamental kind of bedrock of our democracy, is having an election where both sides can lose.
Yeah. It's a really good point that there was such a thin line between the American experiment continuing and Trumpist chaos. And it took, Republican governors like Ducey in Arizona and Kemp in Georgia, as well as the election officials, that the higher ranking election officials in those states. It took, even before that, when, arguably perfectly legal means that they were exploring the 60 plus cases that the Trump campaign was exploring. And the ones that stood out were Trump appointed judges at every level, including at the Supreme Court level. That was a thin line that we were counting on. But it goes back to what you were saying about how Venezuela's democracy was disintegrating. And it was these loyalty tests, replacing lifelong civil servants with people who are loyal, in this case, to Trump. That's part of Project 2025. People who are being put on the campaign, people that they're going to populate in the administration, people that they're going to replace civil servants with. Question number one is, are you loyal to Trump? That's where that that's where that line that's where that line breaks down. That's where we begin to lose what we have as a constitutional republic. So I'm really concerned. I joke around about looking for the shiny ponies, but they're being concerned about the brittle nature of our democracy is not hyperbolic. It's very real. I would like to take a moment and do a bit of a deep dive on, since this is your purview now, to take a look at the Republican primary. So, setting aside any number of other contingencies and possibilities, Donald Trump is a presumptive nominee. So I wanted to look at how we got here. If we look at Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina, all the Super Tuesday states, of the Republican primary voters, what percentage voted for Nikki Haley?
Yeah, so I mean, if you take everything, she wound up getting about 20% of overall Republican primary votes, but it varied quite a bit, and that number. I've still been counting, like, even after she dropped off, because she's been getting such high percentages. In places like Arizona, Florida, yeah, where she dropped out, and she still got 100,000 or more votes in some of those places. Ohio too, So, but overall, like, roughly, she got 20 to 25%. With her obviously it varying greatly, with her winning Vermont or DC and getting 43% in New Hampshire and stuff like that. So she has consistently, like, gotten a very sizable proportion of the Republican primary vote.
So we'll talk about specific states in a second, because I do think that there are 6 or 7 states that the presidency will be hinging on. But I do want to dig into that 20 to 25% number first. How many of them were Democrats who switched to Republican just to mess up the Republican primary? How many were actually lifelong Republicans who are looking for an alternative to Trump? How would you break down that 20 to 25%?
Yeah, so it's hard before we have all of the voter files to know exactly. But I think you could roughly estimate, based on the exit polls, based on some of the surveys that have been done since then, that roughly 40% of her voters were either Democrats or independents who have previously voted for either Biden or in Democratic primaries. And so that's a large group, right? The independents who have voted Democrat or Democrats, some of them genuinely liked Nikki Haley and the messages, and they may have thought Biden was too old or Biden was too liberal or something like that. So, not all of those people were what some people have, like, called saboteurs or whatever. They're just left of center people that voted for Nikki Haley. But 40% captures those two groups. I would call them the kind of the Democrats, the hardcore Democrats that really wanted to defeat Donald Trump. And then there's the kind of softer kind of Democrats that may not yet fully support Joe Biden in that group of 40%. And then, that you have about 50 to 60% that are the opposite, that are either Republicans or who are behavioral Republicans, who are independents that have typically voted in Republican primaries or for Republican president.
So of that, you said 50 to 60% of those who voted for Haley. That's a pretty significant number. So the Lincoln Project had the quote unquote Bannon line in 2020, where they said, I forget what the exact number was, but they said if they could take that number, Republican voters, and get them to vote for Biden, and it was a single digit number. It was like 3 to 5%. They ended up getting significantly more than that, especially in key states. That's where they exerted most of their efforts. Do you think that number is realistic? 3 to 5% of lifelong Republican voters, perhaps even folks who voted for Trump in 2016. Do you think that's what it's going to take, or is it going to take more than that in the coming election? If so, where do you think that line is?
Yeah, so I mean, if you compare the number of Haley votes to the difference between Biden and Trump in the 2020 election, I think in almost every 5 of the 6 swing states that have voted so far, the number of Haley voters significantly surpasses the margin of difference between Biden and Trump. So the other data point, I guess I would say, if you look at places like in South Carolina, 60%, I think, of Haley's voters said that they would not vote for Trump in November. In North Carolina, and was fascinating to me because North Carolina was not an open primary, it was a semi-open primary. So Democrats couldn't vote in that primary, but 79% of those that voted for Nikki Haley said they would not vote for Trump in November.
Which state is this again? This is North Carolina.
North Carolina. So
oh, that's
79,
significant.
and there were 250,000, I believe 260,000 maybe, Nikki Haley voters in North Carolina. And I think the margin in 2020 was, I could be wrong, but I think it was like 70,000. I have it written down somewhere. But basically, so if you can get, I would say 30% of Haley Republicans in some of these states to vote for Joe Biden, and you'll get like, let's say 10 or 20% or even more that won't vote for Joe Biden, but at least they may have been 2020 Trump voters that will not vote for Trump this time. Like, yeah, that would move, in some of these states, 100,000, 50 to 100,000 voters. So that's the goal. I mean, I think you could definitely get more, definitely in the 10 to 20% range of Haley Republicans, not Haley voters, but Haley Republicans that would vote for Biden, and an additional 10% or so that would vote not for Biden, but not for Trump either. And that's the goal of, to some extent, Haley voters for Biden. Now, we are focused, what I would say in response to your question is like the Lincoln Project and other groups like Republican Voters Against Trump, they have a much wider pool that they're trying to get to. And so getting 3 to 5% of Republicans, is a much bigger number than getting 20 or 30% of Haley primary voters, right? They're a very different group that we are kind of hyper focused on. We're focused on, it's Haley voters. So there's 4 million nationwide, about 830,000 in those kind of 6 or 7 swing states. And so we want to get a big margin of those voters to not vote for Trump.
It seems to me that your work complements the work of organizations like Bill Kristol and Sarah Longwell's group. For example, we got to talk to Bill Kristol a couple of weeks ago, and they were focusing on 6 out of the 7 states. They were one of the groups that wasn't including North Carolina, but it was clear that already by the time I got to talk to Bill, which is a special treat, by the way. I'm such a fanboy. I don't know if you can tell, but it was clear that he was already persuaded that, you know what, we're gonna invest some resources in North Carolina for some of the very reasons that you're citing right now. But I can go geeky and quantitative all day long, but I'm interested in some of the qualitative. So how do you translate this information into messaging? How do you target individuals that are persuadable, and what does that messaging look like?
Yeah, so I think first I'll say I agree with you. Bill Kristol's great. He was also, I think, a huge champion of the work we were doing to get like some of those left of center voters to vote against Trump in the Republican primaries. And now what I would say is, well, we've flipped from getting kind of trying to get left of center voters who didn't particularly love Nikki Haley and had a lot of policy disagreements with Nikki Haley, but we asked them to vote for her anyway because of, democracy and, a lot of reasons like, white supremacy or whatever it was
that's the bumper sticker, ... because democracy.
Right. Well, right. But I think despite, what we talked about for the first 20 minutes and some of the reasons why I got into this, I went to a bunch of Nikki Haley rallies. I've been chatting a lot with, Nikki Haley voters, including, the center right and the Republican and conservative ones. And I would just say, like, yes, preserving our republic and democracy is important to them, but Nikki Haley, never on the campaign trail talked about January 6th or that Trump was really a threat to our democracy. She would talk about how Trump was a threat to other things, and how Biden was also a threat to certain things that she held dear. And just talking to some of like the groups that were working with Nikki Haley voters and work, whether, super PACs or there was an Independence for Nikki Haley group, there were a lot of like, there was a lot of testing done, and democracy and, being anti-MAGA or anti-Trump was not their highest priority. It wasn't even close, right? The border was like top of mind in talking to these people and how they feel the border is broken. The Ukraine and Russia is high for Nikki Haley voters. Israel is high. Fiscal kind of, she talked about how Republicans and Democrats had both kind of blown up the debt, and things that we could do about that. So like what we have found, and this is, it's still being tested to some extent, but like what we have found, or what our hypothesis is that we're complementing the work of other groups that criticize Trump about democracy all the time, but for Haley voters, they already know what they need to know about democracy. What they want is a discussion of like how Biden is going to address the issues that they most care about, or how Trump is. Like that's what they're gonna decide based on whether they vote for Trump or so. I one kind of eye-opening moment for me in as we kind of pivoted from being pro-Haley to trying to encourage people to consider Biden was like when you saw the reaction, I think, to most Democrats and most pundits when Biden gave his State of the Union speech, and everyone was like, there he goes, he's not too old, he's got his vigor, he's combative, he's showing that he cares. He made some outreach to Haley voters with his comment about Reagan and the wall and stuff like that. And I was like listening to Haley voters and watching how Haley voters responded. And they were like, oh, everything he said about domestic spending and domestic policy reminds me why I'm a Republican and not a Democrat. So like, I think the messaging that we're focused on is, look, Joe Biden is going to be able to tout Joe Biden's bipartisan accomplishments and Joe Biden's policies on all these issues and abortion and all this other stuff. He doesn't need a group to talk about that. What he needs, or what the area that we fill, the niche that we fill, is we can criticize Joe Biden. We can talk about the way Haley voters feel, their concerns about him. And we can say, just like we said, during the primaries, you don't have to love Joe Biden, right? There are reasons why you should not vote for Trump anyway. Like, even if you don't like Joe Biden or you don't trust Joe Biden on these issues. And it's less about democracy for them. It's more about, Trump being divisive and Trump being horribly, like, just horrible towards Haley voters and toward Nikki Haley and her family during the primary. So it's a totally different argument, but some of the kind of rationales for how we go out are different than other groups, I guess is what I'd say.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's it's I find Liz Cheney's messaging to be pretty persuasive. That essentially, you can have any number of policy disagreements, but we can adjust, in coming years for policy differences. What we can't adjust, what we can't put, the toothpaste back in the tube is a broken constitution, a broken democracy.
So yeah, and look, I think Liz Cheney has contributed so much to the national dialogue. But what I would also just point out, I think from looking at like New Hampshire and Nikki Haley's candidacy, like look at all the differences between the way Nikki Haley handled and talked about Donald Trump versus even, very easy comparison is Chris Christie, who took a more forthright kind of anti-Trump, that Trump was a threat to democracy. And Chris Christie was getting around 10, sometimes up to 15% of the New Hampshire electorate. But like you talked about, there were a lot of like left-leaning people in Christie's coalition. And right before he dropped out, I saw polls showing that Chris Christie was getting about 3% of Republicans in New Hampshire, of genuine Republicans. And so what I would just say is like, yes, Liz Cheney has her constituency and she has a very powerful message, but like there's a big difference between the Nikki Haley voters and the kind of Liz Cheney voters, and the messaging to get them to not support Trump is very different. And I'll just add, a lot of Republicans don't like the way, whatever your views on January 6th, they feel like January 6th and democracy are being like used to like shame Republicans or embarrass them. And they've heard it enough, is kind of their view. And so, look, I mean, it's not useful for me to kind of get into a debate about those things. At the end of the day, if you want to preserve our democracy and our constitutional republic, then Biden needs to win more votes, right? And
Yeah.
Trump needs to get fewer votes. And so if a message about the border or about Israel or about Ukraine is something that Haley voters want to talk about and they don't want to talk about January 6th, then I say Biden needs to talk about those issues then.
Yeah. I'm curious about there's a lot of things in terms of strategy that I'm curious about where you're leaning. So focusing again on those 50 to 60% Republican voters who seem to be inclined not to vote for Trump. Number one, some of my buddies who've run campaigns say we need the +2. In other words, they need not only for them to, like voting for Mickey Mouse, that doesn't count. They need to write in Joe Biden. Are you a +1 guy, or are you really going? Does it matter that they actually write in Joe Biden versus like Mitt Romney? He writes in Ann. He's written in Ann in 2016 and 2020.
So I mean, I think like anyone else, I think there are a lot of +2s out there, and I think that the Biden campaign and others should make every effort to get as many +2s. I'm not used to calling them +2s, but I totally love that. And yes, made the point that if you, as opposed to the uncommitted voters on the left who will either vote for Biden or not, most of them are not going to vote for Trump. The beauty, the value from a strategic perspective is that a lot of these people can be +2, where you take them away from Trump and get them to Biden. But what I would just say, given the focus again on that these are a lot Republicans, and a lot of them view themselves as like Reagan conservative Republicans. Nikki, there was an article a couple weeks ago about well, it'd be great if Nikki Haley would endorse Joe Biden. there's no way she's going to endorse Joe Biden, right? There's no way that like John Bolton is gonna say I love Joe Biden. Like everything that they believe in is that Joe Biden is like, they talk about the like road to socialism and all this stuff. So look, for those people, like particularly if you don't live in a swing state, you know, it doesn't even matter. Like if they want to vote for Trump in a state that's not a swing state, then I'm not even gonna really worry too much about
Yeah.
that. But like if you're in a swing state and you are, a two-time Trump voter and you're gonna write in Nikki Haley or honestly write in Mickey Mouse or vote for RFK or whatever you want to do, like that I'll take a plus one. Like definitely like that moves like I say, everything I'm thinking about to some extent is like uh the only thing that matters for November in those kind of seven swing states is that Biden gets one more vote than Donald Trump. And so anything that raises Biden by one or makes Trump go down by one, yeah, we'll definitely take it.
So we alluded to the states, the swing states. So I'm assuming that you're focusing your efforts on some key states. So far, almost everyone has that I've heard really analyze this coming presidential election have identified either 6 or 7. The Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then the Sun Belt, the so-called Sun Belt states, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, and like I said before, North Carolina is the 7th, and not everybody is on it believes that one is up for grabs. Everything I'm seeing though indicates that, especially at statewide elections, that there's an opportunity there if some efforts are being placed. Where is your head at in terms of where the action is, and how are you prioritizing where you're investing your resources for Haley voters for Trump? For Haley voters for Biden.
Yeah, don't give away that idea of
Sorry.
voters for Trump organization.
Yeah.
No, it's fine. I mean, I think they just, they would say, well, that's like being a Republican, I guess. But it's interesting that there's been no actual outreach from the Trump campaign to their fellow Republicans. But anyway, look, we are focused on those 7 states. We definitely view what happened in North Carolina as an opportunity. There's a number of other factors that you are aware of in North Carolina with it's who knows if the reverse coattails effect, but how many Trump Stein voters will there be in North Carolina? I mean, I think Robinson is a liability for the Republicans in North Carolina, and you see that already in the polls. So we are, I think more focused on it's because it's too early and we don't have a crystal ball. We don't have more information about which state is going to be the actual tipping point state. We view all 7 of those states as states where we should prioritize. In Nevada, it's harder for us because Nikki Haley didn't campaign in Nevada. She only got 25,000 votes or so. It was this weird system where there was a primary and a caucus. So like, it was closed. So they all are Republicans that voted for Nikki Haley. But it's hard for us to have that much of an impact there. That's more the kind of Nikki Haley-like voters or the Republican voters against Trump or something like that may have more of an impact. Whereas in places like Michigan, where Nikki Haley got almost 300,000 votes, and all of the press stories that you saw coming out of Michigan were, look at these 100,000 uncommitted voters on the left. And there was very little attention given to the 300,000 voters that voted for Nikki Haley. And a lot of people at the time dismissed these voters in Michigan as being like, there's a lot of Democrats and left of center voters that are voting for Nikki Haley, so we don't need to worry about them. That was the argument from the right. And what I would just say, yes, Michigan was an open primary, but we talked to so many voters in Michigan who they were not compelled by our argument of, hey, this is your chance to stop Trump, because of the Rashida Tlaib and the uncommitted movement, all of the Democrats we talked to in Michigan either voted uncommitted or voted for Joe Biden. So we think that in a place like Michigan, most of those 300,000 votes, we'll be able to verify this once we get the voter files, but we think that most of them, more than the average that we talked about earlier, are actually conservative or Republican voters. And so if Joe Biden wins the Detroit suburbs but loses Dearborn, he's still going to win Michigan. And so that's the point we're trying to make, to some extent, to the Biden campaign and to others, is like, you're spending a whole lot of time focusing, and trying to send envoys and emissaries and inviting Muslim leaders. And that's great. I understand why he's trying to shore up the base. But if anything you do loses a significant portion of these suburban conservative women in Detroit, then you better think about that twice. So yeah, in places like Michigan, 300,000, North Carolina, 250,000, the 70 something thousand, voters in Georgia and Wisconsin, given how small the margins were in those states, the 100, like Arizona is a huge opportunity because there were 110,000 Nikki Haley voters, and the margin in 2020 was 10,000. And so, I mean, I think we could spend a lot of time on Arizona and the politics of abortion and stuff like that, but Arizona is looking very good right now, I would say. And I think the Haley voters was a huge positive sign there.
I started to think about this because, to your point, I'm concerned of the leakage of for Biden between 2020 and 2024. Mike Madrid is a specialist on the Latino vote, so that's a huge part of that. But since October 7th, in particular, these campus protesters and people who are blocking bridges now. I don't mean to generalize and put everyone all in the same group, but there is a wide swath of voters that are leaning away from Biden for various reasons. The conflict in Israel-Palestine being one of them. But to your point, so tell me again, and forgive me for asking you to clarify, but the 300,000 in Michigan is significantly more than the 100,000 that voted uncommitted. What is the 300,000 again there?
Haley voters, and I would say mostly right of center Haley voters. So that's she got 296,000 votes in Michigan.
296,000 votes. So that is a significant number. And so the question in my mind is, I don't need more reasons not to vote for Trump, but for a guy like me who would have been a Haley voter in a heartbeat, but for somebody like me, one of the many reasons that Trump is so unpalatable for a voter like me is that he spends more time doing outreach to very fine people on both sides, the guys who are running over their supposed enemies with cars in Charlottesville and dining with neo-Nazis and bear hugging. Just like, so it's why is he spending time blowing kisses to people like this as opposed to reaching out to Haley voters? So the same question can be asked. There are voters on campuses all over the country who are pulling down the posters of babies who are missing. Does Biden need to do outreach to them the same way that I would ask, does Trump need to do outreach to neo-Nazis? because I see them in a similar light of extreme screamers, if you will, temper tantrum throwing. Yes, they're voters. Yes, they have a voice, but I have very little interest in reaching out to them. They've taken all the oxygen out of the room, out of the public square. And the 85% of us who are what Common Ground Committee would call the exhausted majority, I'd like for the 85% of us to be reached out to. And to your point, the numbers bear that out. And just in a state like Michigan, which is one of the main swing states, there's 296,000. That's fertile ground, baby. More so than the 100,000 uncommitted. And we could do all of this at the same time. So one thing I did want to ask you about, we've been talking about Haley voters for Biden, but that's distinct from another group that you're involved with, this 501c4, if I'm correct, Haley Voters Working Group. What are the differences, and what is Haley Voters Working Group? What is the what's the mission of Haley Voters Working Group?
Right. So kind of following these lines that we've been talking about, and I would say, Biden campaign has sent some very encouraging messages, and the Haley voters have noted those. That Trump, I think, Steve Bannon said, like, screw Nikki Haley and her supporters. They're all Democrats anyway. Like, they're actively like seeming to repel away and push away Nikki Haley voters, which I think is a huge strategic error on their part. But what we found is, like, okay, the Nikki Haley voters welcomed these messages, and then the ads that the Biden campaign sent out highlighting how Trump has spoken so poorly of them. But he said, like, basically, Nikki Haley voters have a seat in our campaign. Like, they are welcome to join our campaign. And most of the messaging I've received from Haley voters is, that's great. We appreciate this message, but we still have significant concerns. We're not there. We're not Democrats, and we see Biden spending, and his campaign spending, so much time trying to address the concerns of the left, of these uncommitted voters in Michigan. They sent envoys to Illinois, invited Muslim leaders to the White House, and you see things like, abstaining on the UN resolution, or Chuck Schumer's speech, and the reaction of Haley voters saying, I can't support this, he's just too far to the left. And what we determined, based on like discussions with a lot of these voters, is, they don't want to just be talked at, right? They feel like they're a significant voting bloc. They have 4 million voters. It's going to be more once you reach Pennsylvania, and they're larger than the uncommitted voters. And so their view is, why is the Biden campaign not asking them for their input, or what they care about, or what they would want to see change? Like, very simply, like, you've seen maybe some of these articles about, like, the executive order on the border. Like, for Haley voters, like, of course you need to do something like that. They feel like border is the number one issue, and it's broken, and it needs to be fixed. And so, like, listen to those voters. And so what we did is we put together, like, we started doing some outreach. We put together some ideas based on the things Nikki Haley was talking about during her town halls, what she cares about, what her conservative voters care about. Honestly, democracy is not even on the list, because Biden's going to handle that. But like, we came up with 12 issues that Haley voters care about, including some of the ones I've already mentioned, but also things like abortion, or energy and climate change issues, or there's a number that we can go into in more depth. But basically, where Haley voters' priorities are on those issues, and not like making demands of the Biden campaign or the Biden administration, but just kind of saying, these are the things you could do that would bring you a little bit closer to this exhausted majority. And so we put together, like, we reached out to a lot of like Haley leadership teams, Women for Nikki, Haley volunteers, people who have been very proactive and actively supporting Nikki Haley on social media sites, and asked them to provide input and join the discussion. And we've got about like now 25, a good set of 25 genuine conservative Nikki Haley supporters. And we haven't done like formal outreach to the Biden campaign, but we we've started to send feelers out to be like, hey, this group would like to be like listened to, and here's some ideas that they want to talk about, and we'll see if the Biden campaign engages.
Yeah, and listen, the same way that I viewed Nikki Haley's messaging during the Republican primary, a lot of my Democratic friends, progressive, liberal friends, they didn't like a lot of what they heard. But I said, keep in mind, she's talking to a Republican primary constituency. So a lot of what you're hearing, this is the messaging she needs to win over that vote in order to stay relevant in this primary contest. So I have a long runway for that off ramp from the Trump train. Similarly, I understand. Well, on the one hand, we're trying to do outreach to the Genocide Joe crowd would kind of be alienating to someone like me. I would be forgiving or have some patience give some long runway, if you will, with Biden if he's trying to do with Jill Stein and Cornel West voters. There's some overlap there with the Genocide Joe crowd, but I don't think they're all, some folks are pretty considerably to Biden's left. So I do have to have some wiggle room there for him to do with Cornel West and Jill Stein what he did with Pete Buttigieg and Klobuchar voters pre-South Carolina in the 2020 campaign. Hopefully he can do some of that work. I'm curious though. At the same time, what has communicated to me the most as a center-right voter, somebody, like I said, who would have voted for Nikki Haley if she was the nominee, big fan. What has communicated to me the most about Biden's administration so far, three and a half years into the administration, is mostly the legislation that's actually gotten done. The legislation, the big pieces of legislation that have gotten done, you could take CHIPS, you could take Safer Communities Act. That's a good example where Cornyn, a conservative Republican from Texas, was the one who led that legislation. And what I think Biden does best is allowing his loyal opposition to lead negotiations, even failed negotiations, or one that did about a year ago when McCarthy was still Speaker of the House. It was McCarthy who was in the room, not his Democratic colleague, the minority leader, Hakeem Jeffries. It was McCarthy who was in the room that helped them avoid the financial cliff. CHIPS was another one. Manchin, the most conservative Democrat in the Senate, was the one who led the ERA. And we're seeing the benefits of that in terms of healthcare subscriptions and some climate, centrist climate initiatives. So it was a bipartisan infrastructure act. His ability to allow his loyal opposition to lead negotiations. That's what communicates to a centrist like me. Anyway, I could talk about this forever. I am curious, before we start to land to the plane, what your thoughts are about third-party candidates. Are you concerned about Cornel West and Jill Stein voters? I'm also curious to get your sense of whether you think RFK voters are pulling more from Biden, from Trump. Where's your head at with third-party candidates?
Yeah, so one thing that I would say is if you're a third-party voter in, New York or California, I would say like your voice matters and your vote matters. And, if you want to pull Biden.
You're much nicer than me, man. I call that empty calorie votes. New York and California, right. It's like, okay, whatever, do your thing,
Right. But but also like voting for, Biden, to be honest, in a state like California
It's
doesn't
still empty
really
calorie
get
votes.
you right. Like, so if you're going to spend those calories, you might as well vote your conscience.
Yeah.
And I think it's healthy for like the Biden campaign. I'm a big advocate of the Biden campaign. I don't, they should be reaching out to the left, and people have genuine concerns about I mean, there's the people that call him Genocide Joe, but there's also a lot of people who are just concerned about the level of, civilian casualties in Palestine, and like he needs to have those dialogues. He also, before getting into your specific question, like there's been articles written like he should totally be reaching out to Chris Christie and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins and Cheney and Kinzinger. Like, I assume they're going to do that and they just haven't gotten around to it yet. But like that's critical to show that I think he should be having dialogues with, and his emissaries, if not him, should be also talking to, Jill Stein voters, Cornel West voters, because yeah, they feel very strongly about a lot of issues with respect to like Israel, the immigration, with respect to climate change. And I think it's interesting when you see these polls of like they say like, okay, if you had to choose between Biden and Trump, how would you vote? And then if you had to choose between, and then you get all these other options on there, how would you vote? Like most of these people, obviously in the Stein and West camps, you know, Trump is their last choice. They know how dangerous Trump is in terms of climate change policy or in terms of relationship with Israel or immigration policy and separating families from their children and things like that. Like they know how bad Trump is. They would prefer if you really drill down on them or whatever, not in a negative way, but they would prefer not like happened in 2000 where, George W. Bush won because of, in some respects, Nader. In
Yeah.
2016, they get accused of throwing the election to the Republican, and I don't think that's their intent. So for the people that can vote for Jill Stein and Cornel West, right, like, but if you're in that swing state, um, I would just say like that's where difficult decisions around the dinner table kind of have to happen of like, well, do you want Trump or do you want, do you want Trump? Like, because it's not easy to vote for a third party. And to your question about RFK, like I think I would just note that I think Trump is actually doing a relatively good job of I, I find myself, it's weird for me to say that, but Trump is doing strategically, he's doing a good job of focusing on where RFK like lines up, that he's been a Democrat and that he is, pro environment and things like that. And he's saying like, oh, he's taking more votes from Biden because he's a Democrat. And I think there's not enough of maybe a complementary effort of from Democrats yet of saying like, yes, but look at his positions on like vaccines or, where his conspiracy theory, like his embrace of conspiracy theories and things like that, that, in terms of like some of the things that his campaign has said about January 6th and stuff like that, like there needs, because I do think it's when you have polls that add RFK to the mix, Biden tends to do a little bit worse. And so to me, that says that he's pulling more votes, slightly more votes from Biden, but it depends on the poll and it depends on the state and all that stuff. It's not so I think both sides kind of have to convince RFK voters that, he's more conservative. It benefits the Democrats to say that. For Trump, he needs to convince people that RFK is actually more of a Democrat. And I would just say, like, I think complementary to that, I think there does need to be like an embrace of these voters in non-swing states to be like, we appreciate you and we want you to do well. But the converse of that is be really careful about handing the election to Trump.
Yeah, yeah, that's where the +1 versus +2 comes in. And forgive me if I'm not using, professional terms for that. It's just the way I think of it. The +1 in this instance being if Biden's campaign has the resources to target specifically Trump voters and almost do some campaign work for RFK with Trump voters, because there are some Trump voters who are never going to vote for Biden. But if you can persuade just enough Trump voters to vote for RFK, then the way I see it, there's not enough information yet, but the information that I've seen, it's 60-40 that RFK is pulling from Trump versus Biden. I just don't know which way the 60-40 is going at this point. So if Biden's campaign can reach Trump voters and persuade enough to vote for RFK, that's a +1 that I'll take,
Right. And I would just say, like, this is out of my lane to some extent, but I would just say, like, it's not necessarily the Biden campaign, right? But it's somebody needs to be out there saying, like, look, Trump did Operation Warp Speed. Trump had Tony Fauci as his, as his head of the, NIH battling coronavirus or whatever. Like, and if you actually care about, like, whatever health freedom, then RFK is a better choice for you. If you have skepticism of the way, so that's an argument that the Biden campaign can't really make.
Yeah.
But somebody should be making that argument, because if you move an RFK voter that if you move a Trump voter that really hates all the COVID mandates and blame, like, RFK is a better choice for them. And that ultimately helps Joe Biden.
All right. So I have a couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up. This is the TP&R question. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So I'm talking about people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
Yeah, so one of the things that I think really helped during the primaries, just spending a lot of time in New Hampshire talking to Trump voters, talking to firm MAGA voters versus Haley voters and DeSantis voters and stuff like that, is like, I treated every conversation, and I think some of my colleagues, as just kind of like opportunities to listen and learn, and uh, and be accepting. Like, with a hardcore MAGA voter, you're not going to, like, get them off of how much they love Trump, and you just find out, like, well, this is the way they feel about, like, all the peaceful January 6th protesters, and how they're being persecuted. And this is how they feel about, like, various conspiracy theories that are out there, or or that Zelensky's a Nazi or whatever it is. Like, they have, if you talk to the very extreme, that support Trump. And what I would say is, like, I always felt like I needed to, like, insert but did you hear about how Trump's spending campaign fees to pay for his legal, like, because you can't just, like, give them a total pass, but, like,
right.
You say, like, oh, that sounded a little concerning to me or whatever, like, because you have to challenge them just a little bit, like, but and their news sources, because, like you said, they're getting totally different news sources. So the reason why that was so valuable, just beyond just the humanity and establishing that these are, like, people that think that they're doing something good for the country, is it really helps, actually, not with that voter, but with the marginal voter, that is trying to choose between Trump and DeSantis, or between DeSantis and Haley. If you know what they're hearing on their right, like, about January 6th, or about Ukraine, or whatever it is, or Israel, like, it helps you kind of balance and say, well, okay, this is what you're hearing from the right or whatever, and you're not going to believe anything you hear from the squad or the extreme left, but maybe think about it in this way. And so if you treat like I every conversation is like treat them like obviously you this is obvious to you and your listeners, but like treat them as humans, valuable, respectful, that have a vote that they care about. But also I would say like to some extent use each conversation as like a focus group or something that will help you, even if you don't convince them, it may make you more able to have a better conversation with somebody that you can convince.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I do try to tune into whether it's Fox News, certain Fox News shows, or podcasts that are ranking pretty high on the conservative. I hate to use the word conservative because it's not conservative, but right wing media, if you will. And two subjects yesterday, because I was curious to see, are they covering this historic case, this criminal case? And the answer is no. Like the two stories when I tuned in, one was Britt Barry. It was a news oriented program, and he was talking about how transgender youth are trying to basically kick your kid off their varsity sport. And the other one was on Hannity's show. They were talking about inflation, which, listen, it ticked up last month, but a lot of the other facts that they were using were like what I now think of as bespoke reality facts.
Right.
So, but that's I guess that's maybe next time we talk, we'll get more into that. But do you have any questions for me?
Well, I guess what I would, and I know you, thank you for prepping me that there would be like an interview, job interview, a question I could ask at the end. And I guess what I would ask, given all these conversations I've had from, the last 7 or 8 months, is, I guess this is the two-part question. It's one, you know, do most of the people that you talk to feel the same sense of alarm that there is that like the house is burning down, and that this election, because you always hear this is the most important election of our lifetimes, and do people really feel like this is the most important election of their lifetimes? And then secondly, from them and the people they talk to, um, are they doing anything different this year besides, because I feel like there's a lot of like, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but like complaining about it and worrying about it, um, and people committing to like vote for Joe Biden or vote in the way. But are people doing anything different or exceptional in terms of like, calling all their friends and, or holding house parties or doing like to raise money or doing something different? Like, are people treating, so that's, to what extent do people feel that the house is on fire? And to what extent then are people like trying to, call the fire department and or become volunteer firefighters?
Yeah, no, it's an interesting way to frame that question. Are people alarmed? Yes. That's the answer. And the interesting thing is I'm in two very distinct worlds. So people that I go to church with, here in my hometown where my kids went to a Christian school for like a decade, so that world is alarmed about, well, some of those are like eschatologically alarmed. And I'm like, take it easy. God's not biting his fingernails, worried about the future of, that Biden is going to come and eat our children and whatever else you're freaking scared about. Like, I have a little less patience for the people in my Bible study who are kind of in that world, as you can tell. But they are genuinely alarmed, and I need to be sympathetic with, their anxieties. There's other folks who are like looking at some of the same things that I am, where January 6th is a big deal. The fact that so many folks are not just thinking about, but in some ways actually preparing for the possibility that violence will break out and you know that this is something that we need to be concerned about. People checking in on our polling place, for example, just to make sure folks are behaving themselves. So yeah, folks are alarmed, and just even in the most mundane ways, how many people are asking me because they know that I've been, this is an endeavor I've been involved with now for 3.5 years. So they're checking in with me. Hey, are you concerned? What are you looking at? The number of people that are asking me questions like that has definitely ticked up considerably, not just because of what I'm doing here. So yes, people are alarmed. Are people doing anything about it? Gosh, in some ways I would say no, but in other ways I can't be concerned about all of that. What I would say is that in my little corner of the world, yes, this is why I'm still doing what I'm doing. I can't control what everybody else is doing. I can control what I'm doing right here. I can control the conversations that I'm having on this platform. I can control conversations that I'm having at the bar or in my coffee shop, you know, over dinner or going to my buddy's house, talking around a fire pit. You know, I can control to a certain degree my reactions and how I'm engaging in those conversations. And hopefully, to your, you know, you said something before that resonates with what my philosophy is like, listen, in those conversations, I can't, how you described interacting with voters in New Hampshire. I can't expect to sit down at a Waffle House and get somebody who's voted Republican up and down the ballot their entire life to all of a sudden become blue, you know, all the way through. But maybe I can have one degree of persuasion on that person. If I've earned some kind of credibility enough to have a relationship with this person, that we're not just having one interaction online, but we're actually sitting down, sharing a cup of coffee, you know, and then maybe we're coming back and, you know, having another conversation a week later, maybe I can have one degree of persuasion on that person and hope that sovereignty is working on that person too. So maybe they'll become that +1 with all the work, all the conversations that we're having, if not a +2. So I don't mean to like get an easy way out of answering the second half of your question, but that's all I can do, man. I can do what I can do. I can't snap my fingers and change the entire world.
But one thing I would just say is like you talked about what you can do, what you can control, and I agree with that. But part of the way you're controlling yourself is the way you kind of spread the word through this podcast to the rest of the world. And even equally important is just that one conversation you have in the Waffle House, right? Of like, because it's not just going to impact the person you talk to in the Waffle House, because they're still going to vote Republican, but it's going to impact you. You might learn something in that conversation. And so like, you know, and that makes us better. Like that doesn't mean we're going to go off and vote for Trump either, but like we may have a little bit more sympathy or empathy for the way that they feel.
Yeah, to be able to see somebody as a human being, like I'm kind of dismissive in a joking way about, you know, people in my Bible study who are like, you know, God through, you know, earthquakes and tornadoes is telling us we need to vote for Trump, you know. Like,
and eclipse, don't forget eclipse.
The eclipse, right. The eclipse and the earthquake are telling us we need to vote for Trump. Like, I just don't got time for that. But I know one thing people can do is if you told them how folks can follow you, find more information about Haley voters for Biden, and maybe get more engaged, how can we find out about all the great work that you're doing?
Yeah, so there is the Haley voters for Biden, spelled exactly like that, .org, is a homepage they can go to. We also try to be pretty active on the typical social media sites. So if you look at Haley voters for Biden on Twitter or X or Instagram or Facebook, there's pages. And yeah, just yesterday or a couple days ago, we started the Haley Voters Working Group as well on X. So feel free to, well, not feel free. We encourage you to follow us on that platform as well.
I really appreciate your time, Robert. This is a really fruitful conversation. Thanks for spending the time. We're getting you in right under the wire here. So I hope it's not the last time we get to hang out.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Corey. It's been great.
Absolutely. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow the show and write that review. Like I was saying before, and tell a friend about talking politics and religion without killing each other. We're easy to recommend. Just tell your friends to go to their favorite podcast app and type in without killing each other. You know, without the G at the end of killing. Without killing each other, you'll find our big purple logo. Or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan. That's Corey, S as in Scott, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan. Now, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.